Everybody can write. Hello, and welcome to today's video. We're going to be talking about world building. Now, whether it's a whole galaxy or just one room, creating a place that doesn't exist requires some world building. In this video, I won't be going very much into the nitty-gritty of world building, but I will be hopefully providing you with a bit of a solid start to your world building journey. Let me start off with telling you about a world building experience I had. So here I am writing a book, a fantasy book, that revolves around necromancy and power battles and all sorts of exciting things, and I'm very invested in the characters. And I don't think about it much, but I kind of just shove it into a sort of semi-medieval setting. It looked something like this inside my head. Very blobby, I think you'll find, because I just wasn't very interested. I just chose this setting as a sort of a default generic fantasy setting, and it bored me to tears, and I found it very hard to describe anything. I realised that I needed to do a complete overhaul of the whole setting, and at that point I'd been working on the novel for, I don't know, 2 years I think. So a fairly long time, but as it turned out I hadn't made the setting any sort of integral part of the story because I didn't care about it. So it ended up being fairly easy to switch it out. Now what I ended up going with is basically moving the whole country where the main events happen underground into caves, and above it deserts. I found some pictures from Unsplash to illustrate. And what do you know, suddenly the setting started being an integral part of the story, started telling more about the whole world instead of just being a flimsy backdrop. And I think that was a big improvement. So, what can be learned from my experience? Well, writing a big project is never going to be all fun and games. There's going to be some amount of work involved, but you can aim to make it as easy as fun for you as possible. Not everything has to be, this enormous task. So roughly you've got two options. You can either go with a setting that interests you enough that you will be willing and interested to do some actual, research and really think things through. The other option is to pick something you're really familiar with, because this will make it easier at least, to write vivid descriptions for your environments. Now, when it comes to generic medieval settings, that's not something that I'm really that familiar with in the end, so it didn't interest me enough, and it wasn't familiar enough for me, so disaster all around. And of course there's space in between as usual, so you can lean more towards something interesting you're willing to put your time into, or something familiar that'll be hopefully easier to write. I will add though that if the setting is an important part of the story, let's say how a haunted house, that's basically the main antagonist in a horror story, is very important. So you might want to put your effort into it. So always take into account also how important the setting actually is. If the story is heavily based on character interaction though, the environment might not matter as much, and therefore the world building isn't as important. Alright, so let's say you've figured out your levels of motivation. Where do you go now? Personally, I would recommend writing up documents where you basically detail all the different environments. This will help you both fleshing out all these things and add to them as you come up with new things while you're writing your story. And it will help you keep in mind what you've already decided, so you don't have to keep it all in here. When it comes to writing this environment document, or whatever you want to call it, I've got a couple of tips. The first one is that unless your world, your environment was freshly created out of nothing, every place has some history. So how does this history show? I can give you an example from the previously mentioned novel. In the underground caves, there are these silos that are no longer used as silos, but as homes for the rich, because they are made from metals which were previously bountiful, but not so much anymore, because there's been some environmental things and whatnot. So you can see from this little snippet that there used to be way different agriculture and that sort of thing. But moving on, the way a place is built can show a lot about the power structures of the culture. For example, if there's a smelly factory in town, there's likely to be more lower income housing next to it because, well, it's not pleasant. And going back to my never to be released novel, the capital is built in such a way that it basically has as a main function of protecting its very centre where the royal palace is. There's layers of walls and barricades to protect the palace from being attacked. And thirdly, how does the melding of cultures show? Because whether you're writing a space adventure or a murder mystery in a little town in the middle of nowhere, there's likely to be some culture clash or melding, more friendly melding. One thing that comes to mind is when Christianity came to Finland, the Finns basically started integrating the Christian belief and symbols of it into their religion from before. And that's not unusual from what I've gathered in those sort of things. So how does this show in your story if it does? And those examples I gave you were very people specific. There are all sorts of different things you can take into account, like climate, geography, those sort of things. But personally, as I am someone who tends to start more from people rather than, nature in my writing, this was just the way this lesson ended up going. And hopefully it helped you some. This is obviously not some sort of complete course in world building, but I hope it does give you some sort of a starting point for your own writing and world building. At the core of it all, I do think it is most important to have enough interest in your own created world. Otherwise you're in for a bit of a bad time. And that's all for today. I would love it if you were to leave comments down below, like the video and subscribe, feed the algorithm. And I'll see you next month. Bye!